Greetings and welcome to another webinar with the Center for Financial Studies at SPJMR, at Bhavan's SPJMR. This one is on reflections on banking and governance. And to discuss this very topical topic, we've got three complete industry experts. As you know, we've in SPJMR's Center for Financial Studies, we try and bridge the viewpoints of practitioners, policymakers, regulators, and try and come up with a synthesis across different viewpoints with a view of trying to influence practice and at least furthering the debate. I couldn't have asked for a better panel today than the three gentlemen who I have the privilege of introducing just now. The first two of them are ex-RBI folk who have the privilege of calling them my mentors in many ways. I'll start with Mr. Viswanathan, N.S. Viswanathan, former Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of India. He's been the Deputy Governor through a particularly interesting phase in banking and in central banking for India. And a very quick, again, none of these gentlemen require introductions, but a very quick personal take. Mr. Viswanathan is extremely thorough and knowledgeable about all the areas that he's involved in. I don't think, a lot of us commentators sometimes have a superficial knowledge. Mr. Viswanathan knows the depth of the issues, both from a legal perspective, regulatory perspective, as well as from a business perspective. Now, sometimes when you're burdened with so much of information and knowledge, you can be numb. You can find it extremely difficult to take a call. With Mr. Viswanathan, you will never find that situation. Despite all that knowledge, he still finds it easy to take a call. And the last bit, extremely articulate in explaining very, very logically why he's taken that call, having weighed all the particular factors. I'm sure we can benefit a lot from his interventions today in this very, very exciting topic of banking and governance. Thank you again, Mr. Viswanathan, for being a part of this journey with us. Next, my favorite mentor, Mr. Padmanabhan, in many ways. Former executive director of RBI, and he has reminded me to tell you he's also former chairman of Bank of India. In fact, his term, I think, ended the last week. So he's now absolutely free to speak the way he wishes to speak. Not that it has stopped him ever in the past from having a say. Again, I won't give a long introduction for Mr. Padmanabhan, somebody I admire deeply. One is, the areas where he is an excellent expert, IT, settlement systems, etc. We are not going to talk about. I would regard him as one of the foremost voices in the country in that sphere, technology and IT and settlement systems. He is also an excellent expert on banking and governance, and he's had the privilege of seeing it both as a regulator as well as a commercial banker. And we'll try and tap into that expertise there. Again, my own personal reflections with Mr. Padmanabhan. You go to him with a question, you get a crystal clear answer. And it's a very logical answer, again, like in the case of Mr. Viswanathan. Very, very well explained. It's not a whimsical answer, it's well thought out. And by the way, don't try to pull a fast one over him. I've tried doing that in the past in my old commercial banking days, and he can spot through the fluff in a second. So thank you again, Mr. Padmanabhan, for being here. Really appreciate. Last but not the least, my colleague and my another mentor in the making, learning a lot from him on the research front, Dr. Harshvardhan, consultant. He knows the banking space much better than many other practitioners do. He's worked with a lot of banks, a lot of financial institutions. He's also been on several important committees relating to banking and financial services, etc. So he's been part of the May 2014 PJ&I committee report. He was also recently the chair of the securitization committee set up by the RBI, and whose recommendations are being implemented as we speak. So thank you again, Harsh, for being here. He's also now joining the board of Karur Vysya Bank, and I believe that the first meeting that he's going to be part of is starting shortly. So thank you again, gentlemen, for being here. We will talk about banking and governance. I hope to try and pick your brains on a variety of issues. These include things like disclosures, provisioning, recovery process of bad loans, etc. I'll also try and go into things like why is it that public sector banks seem to have very high losses. I know it's a controversial topic, but I would love to hear a discussion around that. We will, of course, talk about governance itself, which is, there is a new draft paper which has been put out by the RBI. We'll discuss whether it's a good step towards resolving the governance issues we see in the banking system and the financial ecosystem as a whole. And finally, we'll try and understand the process of regulation. How is it that regulators design and devise regulations as we go along? So let's start with the first topic, which is about acknowledging what the true level of bad assets are, disclosures, and of course, trying to resolve those bad assets. And I'm going to start with you, Mr. Viswanathan. In many ways, you were the author of that famous 2018 Feb 12 circular, where RBI was trying to make the recognition of a problem, the default problem, as quick as possible, with as much alacrity as possible. You were also trying to ensure that problems didn't fester on for too long. You were trying to ensure that banks pushed issues which were non-performing into the NCLT and IBC process. After all, the IBC process was set up for that. That circular, of course, as bankers will know, went into a lot of discussions and debate. There was a lot of noise around it, including in the courts. Finally, that circular was pulled back and, in fact, set aside. And a new circular has come in as of June 7th of 2019, where there's a fair amount of dilution which has happened on two levels at least. One is that one date recognition of default has become 30 days. And forcing of NPAs to go into the NCLT and IBC process has been taken away from that particular circular, that version of the circular. So, Mr. Viswanathan, give us the inside story. Why is it so difficult to get disclosures and recovery? Why is it so difficult to put that across in the banking system here? Give us some story behind the Feb 12 circular.
Yeah, thanks, Anand, for that very, what do you call, detailed introduction, maybe more than I deserved. Having said that, this question is very interesting because I think I was part of both the February 12 circular and the June 7 circular, so I will know something that, it's good to disclose that at this point in time. I felt that the February 12 circular was, in a way, a watershed. It's one thing that a regulatory authority is empowered, another that it tries to use that empowerment in a way that it is effective. So maybe, of course, in retrospect and in jest, one can say in the context of Supreme Court judgment that RBI perhaps used little more power than it had in framing the circular. Having said that, look at the principles that it enunciated. It wanted default, one-day default. Because see, I think some of the things I've articulated in my NIBM speech, convocation, where I talked of the debt contract, sanctity of that being maintained, number one. I've also mentioned about many borrowers who are having the capability to pay, delaying payments deliberately because 89-day repayment was par for the course. So I think the main thing that the February 12 circular did was, one, to say that 89 days is not par for the course, number one. Number two, as I said there, we always said that delayed payment is a lagged indicator of a problem. So if somebody is delaying payments, it's not that it is the beginning of a problem, it's an end of a problem. So that's a fundamental principle that we try to articulate. Third, of course, was that I had also talked in the NIBM speech about the banker-borrower nexus in the, what you call, non-pejorative sense, because it suited both to prolong the recognition and, prolong the real action to recover the due. So the February 12 circular tried to put an end to all those things. Unfortunately, of course, the court found that, it was and the provision actually cost me, the judgment talked in terms of only the mandatory reference after 6 months to go to NCLT was found to be ultra-virus. Because it said you could only refer specific cases, but not a general circular like this. But what happened was the court somehow struck down the whole circular. So when it struck down the whole circular, what we had was the status quo ante. The status quo ante, because the circular had superseded number of circulars, and for me the status quo ante was worse than a vacuum. Because it had too many complications thanks to that. So what we had to do was, sue up something that addressed the judicial concern that the Supreme Court, and legal concern that the Supreme Court raised, number one. At the same time, we didn't want the uncertainty to continue. We don't know what will be the other challenges that would come to this, a new circular. So would one day default again get into a legal tangle? So our main intention at that time was that let us put through a circular that largely captures the spirit of the February 12 circular. At the same time, it is not creating more the uncertainty through further legal challenges, and then you have a vacuum, or a worse than a vacuum, of multiple circulars being there in place. So during the discussions or the cases that went to the court, among the things that got discussed, deliberated, as you would see, one of those was the one-day default. Was seen to be too much. That's even happened in the parliamentary committees and things like that. So we thought that could be an area where possibly further challenge could come, and that could so we wanted to have something that will work immediately. And I think if you ask me, from 1 day to 30 days, maybe could be seen as a dilution, but from 89 to 30 days is still a fair bit of putting things together. And I would say that maybe over a period of time, it's something that I wish over a period of time people getting used to 30 days will get used to 1 day as well. So that's what I said. I'm happy to mention here that look, the 30-day norm has become the norm even for the restructuring circular. So that has stayed. Okay. So I think how you must see is that efforts, February 12 circular, if it had remained nothing like it, but I thought the June 12 circular, June 7 circular was possibly the best alternative in the circumstances that we were in, given that the February 12 circular was entirely struck. So we had to do something like this.
Oh, thank you for that, Mr. Vishwanathan. I think you've described it very, very well. A couple of quick follow-through questions. One is, in the immediate aftermath of the Feb 12 circular, there was a lot of clamor saying this is too draconian, we should try and water this down. You think on reflection, it would have been good to actually maybe make that 30-day provision immediately thereafter itself, rather than wait for the courts to strike it down and then come up with a June 7 circular?
See, the court did not strike it down on the 30-day issue. Please understand. The court struck it on a thing that we were not sure was a possibility. The court struck it down on the principle that we didn't have powers to issue a general direction to refer cases to NCLT. So when we were to review that circular, then we thought, look at what were those things that, so it is exactly what we did. Maybe we could have still issued a circular with the 1-day default, because there was no Supreme Court order which said no to it. But possibly we were, doing what you asked us to do now, by looking at that as a possible issue for further litigation that could have brought in further uncertainty. And for us, I think certainty was very important. See, look, one may say that if a court has not stayed a circular, it doesn't matter. But in matters like this, you cannot put the clock back later. No. So I think banks will be very, uncomfortable doing something with the concern that maybe it could be, pushed back related.
Oh, fair enough, sir. And last point before I go to the other speakers, yes, the courts struck down the fact that you can't force everybody to go into NCLT. But I thought what RBI was trying to do was, and I think Dr. Patel has said the same in his book as well. You started off with 12 names, then with 28 names, and you were trying to make it more general across, the entire universe, so that you're not picking and choosing. You don't have discretion with the RBI. You're making it a process. Is it really that difficult in India to force a resolution process, which after all should be good for the ecosystem? You're not doing this for your own good. You're doing for the ecosystem's good. Why is it so difficult to get that in place?
So, the fundamental point is that the fact that VR Act was amended to enable RBI to identify cases to be referred to NCLT speaks a lot. I don't have to say more than that. So I think as I said, it's a larger issue coming from 2-3 factors. One, as I said, it suited everybody to delay, number one. And number two, people found that it is easier to deal with the existing promoter than change the promoter for whatever reasons, right or wrong. Okay. And what those 12 cases, some of the outcomes of those 12 cases have proved is that it works. There were many legal challenges, there were delays, but I thought ultimately they have worked. So I would say that the silver lining in all this is that people now believe IBC will work. Maybe it needs to be faster than it is, but it will become a very good backstop. That's the idea.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Padmanabhan, I'm going to come to you next. You were Bank of India chairman for 5 years, in 2015 and 2020. You saw a fairly tumultuous period from the other side of the equation. You saw AQR, Asset Quality Review. Then you saw the whole PCA exercise. Then, of course, you saw the aftermath of the Feb 12 circular and all of that. Give us your perspective, sitting on the other side of the table, of how you saw these developments.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, thank you for inviting me. I must also say by way of introduction that me and Viswanathan belong to the same batch. So if you see similarities in some of our character or the way we work, I think we joined Reserve Bank of India almost around the same time. Then about the tumultuous period that you said about the Bank of India, in fact, in my farewell, I said, I am reminded of what Dr. Subbarao said about his tenure in Reserve Bank. Probably things started to turn bad the moment he stepped in, because within 7 days of his stepping in, the Lehman happened. And he said, once I step out, everything will be all right. I think probably, I hope it's true for the banking system also. At least Bank of India is also. Now, let me first turn your question and try to answer the reverse, because it's easier. Viswanathan has just spoken. I think, first of all, the kind of issues or the kind of differences that followed that circular, I must say that I was quite surprised. Because to me, I'm talking either side, it wouldn't make a difference whether we are going to do it after 1 day or for 30 days. So whether we should stick to 1 day or 30 days, I think that's something that we could decide. But having said that, please remember, this is one thing that I have always remembered whenever we made policies in Reserve Bank of India, is that India as a country, we either overreact or underreact, right? Now, I'll tell you an example. We are keeping 31st March and 2 days thereafter open, including Sundays for clearing, when the clearing was done through completely manual means. Now we have a 24/7. The clearing system is online. Still we keep this open for the taxes to go in, because as Viswanathan said, people tend to wait till the last minute to pay anything. So this is the community that we the regulators will have to deal with. So, and the other thing which is quite surprising is that when in the capital market, you will have to declare a default on day one that the dues have not been paid. Is there any problem in then communicating that there has been a default and start the resolution process thereafter? But then there were counter arguments stating that the credit market is completely different from the capital market, so we need to have more time. And whether we could have done it better, I do not know. To me, it didn't make a difference. But it also meant that there was some kind of discipline which was coming into the system. Now, let me tell you what exactly happened as far as a public sector bank is concerned. Now, very often you hear the statement in the public sector bank that this time our NPA numbers are higher because we have started recognizing the NPAs through the online computer. So it's a computer generated NPA. So I always tell my people that the computer cannot generate NPA, right? The NPA is already there. The recognition was a problem. Now the recognition got streamlined because of whatever Reserve Bank of India did. But I think there were very strong people who were concerned with the default, and ultimately what has come out, we all know. So to me, I think it was a bit of an overreaction on both sides. We could have probably reached a more amicable settlement, but what has happened is happened. Now you asked me about the AQR and the PCA. Now AQR is something which, according to me, brought in a lot of discipline and transparency as far as the system was concerned. Now, I think they often quoted extent and pretend kind of culture was coming in. And at some stage, the regulator will had to step in and say that we will have to come out and say that this is the truth of the balance sheets as far as the banks are concerned. Now, up to that, I agreed even with Dr. Rajan at that point of time. But where I had a bit of a concern, and ultimately probably Reserve Bank got it right, was that I was not too sure where I was going to find capital as a bank to fund for all these things, because particularly my bank almost had 90% shareholding from the government. So unless the government was going to have resources, and then the fisc in this country has never been in very good shape at any point of time. So I was really worried where we are going to get capital to make sure that we meet at least the regulatory capital to take care of our future. Now, this was a problem. And this remained a problem during the first couple of years of my tenure in the Bank of India for the simple reason that probably on 31st late night or first early morning, I used to get the intimation from the government that you have been given this capital. So till then, we are not even aware that whether we are going to not get, there will be all sorts of rumors coming in, but we were all on our edge till we got this capital. So I had this conversation with Dr. Rajan as to why the recognition is important. Now, unless we are certain that the government will find resources to fund the banks, now, does it make a difference to the system whether this funding happens over 3 years or 5 years? Does it make a difference? Now, this was a difference I always had at that point of time with Dr. Rajan, and they were very clear that I think we need to stick to this to make sure that the capital comes in on time. And I think ultimately Reserve Bank did ensure that the capital get on time. So I think in retrospect, that is fine. Now, if you are linking it to the PCA, I have a bit of quarrel with the way in which the whole thing happened. Because when AQR was announced, I think everyone was clear, and even Dr. Rajan and the other executives made clear in their public speeches and etc., that for the next 3 to 4 years, the balance sheets of the banks are going to get from bad to worse before it start getting better. This was clearly everybody understood. So that is where in 2017, when Reserve Bank of India tightened the PCA norms, I was a little surprised because already you know that you are going to take a hit, and the Reserve Bank of India tightened its norms, as a result of which several banks came under the PCA. So whether the tightening had to be done when the going was not too good, again, that's a call on which I had a view which was different from what the Reserve Bank of India had a view. But then ultimately, I think PCA, let us understand that that was a concept which was there on paper from something like 2002 or something onwards. Reserve Bank of India never used it. So when they started using it in a very serious way, they first tightened the whole screws and then started using that, as a result of which a dozen banks almost came under the PCA. And my view was that it is not to the, for any regulator to claim that I have 12 banks, 12 major banks in my system under the PCA. So whether that kind of tightening was required at that point of time, Reserve Bank had its own reasons, but that's something which the banking system worried about. Let me stop here.
Oh, thank you, sir. So what you're saying is maybe PCA alongside AQR was a bad combination from your perspective. I'm going to let others react to that. But before I go to Dr. Harsh, one quick question to you, sir. Mr. Viswanathan hinted, and in fact, Dr. Patel has also written his book about this banker company promoter nexus, which everybody is happy to go along with some amount of subterfuge, delay the payments, don't change the promoter. Is that a valid point, you think? Is there genuinely a nexus in around the ecosystem which prevents disclosures and resolutions from happening in a clean manner?
See, I don't think I have enough data or material to comment on that specifically, but let me tell you my general view on that whole issue. Now, this nexus probably can be, I think it's a very strong word, but what really happens as far as the public sector banks are concerned, when it comes to the major borrowers, is that once they take the decision of going for resolution and calling it as a problem account, then they will have to immediately find resolution, they will have to find capital, and they will have to go forward and see how this can be quickly resolved. But the problem that the public sector banks face, and I think somewhere we are asking this question later, is that why is public sector banks facing more problems or more NPAs? It is precisely because of the reason that I don't think fundamentally, even in a consortium where the private banks and public sector banks are there, you cannot say that the credit appraisal of one of them was bad. Now let's take classic case of Kingfisher. Now several banks are involved. How the private sector banks got out of the picture is that private sector banks could cut loss and get out at the first sign of trouble. But the public sector banks will have to think twice, thrice before getting out of this, because public sector banks are a strange lot whose decisions are questioned in retrospect after 5 years, 10 years. Now, even today, please remember this. I think it's a major achievement of Reserve Bank of India to get the resolution process and today the restructuring. But please remember, the restructuring decisions are being vetted by a committee. The committee approach is critical because no public sector bank on their own want to take a decision because of the 3 C's or whoever they come in later. Now, this is a problem. I think this is a reality that we will have to realize.
Sure. And when we come to the PJNI committee and public sector banks, we will.
Vishwanathan wants to react.
Mr. Vishwanathan, Harsh has been very patient. So I will send a question to him and then he'll come back to you. I remember the fact that you raised your hand. Harsh, you've been listening very patiently to all this discussion. Please chip in with whatever you have regarding these two issues. But I also had another issue for you, which is, Padmanabhan sir made this point about what is this big deal about, making a clean breast of things, about this disclosure. So from your perspective, do you think disclosure is important? That's question number one. I'm going to segue that question to another point of disclosures in respect of what's happening today. We have the moratorium in place. Eventually we're going to have a restructuring also, as Mr. Padmanabhan just mentioned. Through this period of moratorium, right now, there is incomplete disclosures about what is the size of the moratorium. We don't know how many NPAs can come about later. And through this period of haze, we also have regulators telling every bank to go out and raise capital. So is there a moral hazard here? Are we asking investors to go blind and put in capital into banks? But large topic to you, entirely yours. Thanks, Harsh.
Yeah, thank you, Anant. So I'll try to be quick, given that both Vishwanathan sir and Padmanabhan sir have covered quite a ground. See, disclosure are, I think, generally very critical to well-functioning banking system. And this is not just about NPAs. I have had long since complained that even with standard assets, our disclosures are not adequate. Let me give you an example. Over 90% of corporate loans are rated. And I've been saying granular details of how the ratings have been, what's the breakup of rating, how the ratings have evolved over a period of time, which agency has rated, so that investors know which agency to trust. Some banks do it partially, but most don't, and it's not regulatory mandated. So I go back even to standard assets, and I feel there has to be much larger disclosure there. The other issue, especially with things like moratorium and restructuring, is this. I used to say jokingly, Anand, that if there is a regulatory sponsored scheme, it's like a dip in the Ganges for bankers. Because if I have restructured loans under a RBI BLESS scheme, I am completely scot-free. I have no accountability. That asset might go to NPA later. To every question I answer, I have restructured under an RBI scheme. In any such thing, you have to maintain accountability of bankers. There is always, even within a scheme, there is enough space for discretion and choices that the bankers have to make to maintain accountability. Now, the one way to maintain accountability is through disclosures, because then the whole ecosystem knows what sort of moratoriums, what sort of restructuring you've done, under what condition, the pre and the post restructuring. So my view is that it's supremely critical to have as much. Remember, look at the SEBI standard or capital market standard. Any material change you have to report. There is no greater material change to a bank's business than restructuring a loan or providing moratorium or recognizing NPAs. So I don't know where the complaint again disclosures come. Remember, disclosures are different from provisioning. So when you talk about one-day disclosure, you are saying just tell the world that there has been a default. Now I'll tell you what the problem is. This is to your other point. Is there a nexus? I don't know there is a conspiracy, but there is enough incentive both to bankers and borrowers to not do so. 90% problems in financial services are problems of incentives. And why is so? Bankers believe that, if they don't disclose, then it shows them in good light. For borrowers, remember, there's a very peculiar behavior of Indian system. The moment you go into default, the whole system shuts down for you. You can't get any more loan. That's the peculiar way. That is not so in many other economies where there are specialist banks who would lend to borrowers in difficulty. That's why everybody tries their best to avoid being labeled as a defaulter or overdue or so on. It is lovely to be a standard asset in that CRILIC database. So I think the combination of all these factors makes it not in the interest of either the lender or the borrower to disclose overdue accounts, so on. So I think, especially when now you come to things like restructuring and moratorium, it's actually extremely, extremely important that we significantly enhance the amount of disclosures we do, because that is the only way other stakeholders, other than regulators, such as shareholders, bondholders, depositors, can exercise some degree of control over the managerial behavior, so to say. Let me stop there.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Harsh. To be fair, the restructuring, at least what has come out, does call for a lot of disclosures. But
yes, it does. The latest guidelines do. Yes, yes.
But the actual numbers will come out much later after the
much later. And let me tell you, sorry, one more point, that if you really look at the moratorium, you talked about the disclosure. The RBI Financial Stability Report says that the moratorium as on April 28th, where 50% of outstanding, roughly about 48-49% of number of accounts. There are other estimates which give a very different number. People who have done grounds up estimates. So I find that very odd that, in fact, there have been estimates which have been lower than this has been done by analysts. So even within what seems to be a fairly well disclosed issue, there seems to be disagreement on the level of moratoriums.
Fair enough. Mr. Vishwanathan, sorry, I interrupted you. You were saying something and reacting to Mr. Padmanabhan. Please come in, sir.
Well, 2 points. Actually, one, of course, I think Mr. Harshvardhan mentioned. I think because Padmanabhan used the word nexus is a strong word. I think I have made it very clear, even in my NIBFS saying it today. I don't think even Dr. Patel used it or anybody uses in the negative or the pejorative sense. It's exactly what Mr. Harshvardhan said now, that it suited both. Not to recognize an account as an NPA because they don't have provision, and of course to an extent possibly in the pre-IBC world, after recognizing what? How do you recover? You have to go through the whole legal process. So there were reasons. So we're not getting into the whys or wrongs of it. So I'm saying we didn't use the word since then. I don't think that is the context in which we used it now. Number 2, the second point, of course, I think, in terms of recognition, I would say that the February 12 circular, many of which part has been part of the June 7 circular as well, kind of statements a lot of, ifs and buts that the earlier circulars had, which gave, some benefit of doubt options to banks to classify an account one way or the other. So I think in a way, the February 12 June 7 circular kind of straightens things out, and therefore the interpretational issue that could have to an extent led to some extent. I mean, it's not possible that you can interpret every NPA as a standard and vice versa. But even whatever little was there, I think this has straightened. To that extent, I think the disagreements on classification should account for.
No, fair point, sir. I'm going to come back to you, Mr. Vishwanathan. The same question which I asked Harsh. I think the restructuring circular is good in a tough situation for COVID-19. The current period, sir, of moratorium, where there is no mandatory disclosures around how much of moratorium is underway under different sectors, etc. And therefore, to that extent, as Harsh mentioned very well, stakeholders, whether it's bondholders or equity investors or depositors, aren't really sure about the picture about individual banks. And at this point in time, RBI and the government is also asking banks to go out and raise capital. Is there a moral hazard, sir? Incomplete disclosures, which are being blessed effectively, and at the same time, you're saying, let's go and raise capital.
I think, in a way, I have said something to this effect, what I'm going to say now to this effect, in the sense that, so the RBI has kind of projected in the Financial Stability Report what could be the NPAs at the baseline and extreme scenario. Yeah. Okay. So I used to say that one way of looking at it is that the banks should, apply the extreme scenario to their own balance sheet and say, this is what it could be, and raise capital to meet this. I think that is one way to kind of, reduce this. So take the extreme situation. I mean, things can be even worse than what FSR has projected, but at least you have what the Stability Report has kind of projected as the worst case scenario. that could be kind of juxtaposed with the existing balance sheet of a bank. That could be a bit.
Okay, thank you, sir. I guess it would have been good if RBI had also mandated some kind of disclosure levels, just as it has in the case of restructuring, but we let it go at that. Harsh, sorry, you wanted to come in.
No, I'm just wanted to make a point that RBI has been, yes, encouraging banks. Private sector banks have raised capital, a lot of it. You see no such movement on public sector banks, probably because of the fiscal problems. So we are in a fairly uneven situation right now. Remember, there is an enormous level of risk aversion in the system right now. So despite historically lowest interest rate, credit growth last fortnight came at less than 6%, which is, I think, several decade low. I think the only way to overcome some of the risk aversion would have been to proactively recapitalize banks, and especially public sector banks. We know where the problem is, but I'm saying despite RBI's encouragement, it's only the large private sector bank which seem to be actually taking it up and actually raising capital.
And that's a point that Mr. Padmanabhan also made about waiting for capital at the last minute. But Mr. Padmanabhan, you wanted to come in, sir.
So I wanted to quickly make a couple of points. I think we have spent enough time on this. First, the first point is that I completely recognize and agree with Vishwanathan that earlier the borrowers were moving from one model, one of the restructuring to another restructuring to another restructuring. All this got completely cleaned up with Feb 12, June 7 circular. I think that's something that the system concedes and appreciates what Reserve Bank has done. I think there is no problem as far as that. Now, regarding capital. Now, first of all, I think there have been public sector banks who have raised some few 81 bonds here and there. But let me tell you, last 1 year, 1.5 years, we have been trying to raise this. And every time we tie up everything, there is some problem which happens in the market. And the second thing is always, I think, for the last quite some time, the prices of the public sector bank shares have been rather low. So there is an issue with regard to that. But with regard to the specific point that you raised about the transparency, I think my bank, let me still call it my bank, and every possible bank has worked out 3 scenarios post-COVID and these kind of things. One is moderate, where they, reasonably rosy picture. One is medium, more realistic. The other is the extreme scenario. Now, and I think everyone, most of us have gone in that just stick to the moderate scenario for the time being. Otherwise, if you look at an extreme scenario and start working, we will not be able to work at all. But I think in terms of disclosure, the kind of problems that we are imagining is not there. Every bank has an assessment about what could be the possible issues. And I think when they go to the market to raise capital, these are a part of disclosures which they will have to anyway do.
Fair enough. As you said, sir, we spent enough time on this, so I'm going to go to the next topic related to disclosure, but this time on provisioning. And Harsh, I'm going to start with you. You made the point that disclosure is different from provisioning, but I'm going to tie the two together. Okay. So the current rules, as I understand it, is the first year of NPA, the minimum RBI prescription for provisioning is only 15%. Second year, it goes to 25%. The third and fourth year, it's 40%. Only after 4 years, it goes into 100% of actual provisioning required. Are these reasonable numbers? And are these reflective of what, given that actual recoveries have been much, much lower than this, do you think these are reasonable numbers?
So these provisioning guidelines have been around for a very long time. I think we need to update them in the light of our experience post the bankruptcy law. We have now pretty good empirical evidence on what actually rates of recovery are and over what time period. The ideal setup would be you take the net present value of the recovery and net it off from the exposure, and that has to be provided as quickly as possible. I mean, I don't know where these 2 to 3 years timeline comes from. This probably predates the bankruptcy code. So I think it purely has to be evidence-based. It has to be based on data. Remember, in most of the advanced economies, nobody talks about NPA level. Everybody talks about provisioning. And you have to incent banks to provide. I think RBI also should work with the tax. Let me give an example. What provisioning is allowed as a write-off in the tax laws is very different from what gets provided. Now, a simple way to incent would be to align the two, so that banks have incentive to provide. If I make provisioning of 100 rupees, but I get a tax reduction of only 10 rupees, I have no incentive to do so. And remember, you can always write back provisioning. So if some recovery happens, you are right. So tax guys should not actually be at a loss. I think there are these other areas that we need to work on in order to make the provisioning much sharper. Otherwise, you'll end up in a situation where you always find the banks are underprovided and the system basically runs on an undercapitalized levels. So one day it comes to an extreme situation where suddenly there has to be a lot more capital infusion, and especially in the public sector bank, then it creates a fiscal drag and so on. So I think it's high time that we update these, make them faster, and work with other issues like tax rules around provisioning, so that we are the regulation that incentivize right behavior work the best, in my opinion. So you have to create right incentives through these regulations.
Thanks, Harsh. Padmanabhan sir, I saw you shaking your head quite vigorously, so I'm going to come to you. But my broader point is, how do we get to a situation where banks take the right level of provisions rather than a regulatory minimum mandate or slightly higher than that, and the implications thereof? All yours, sir.
Anand, couple of points. See, these numbers have been there, these numbers, but we'll have to be read with the other aspects which are there. In overseas, they give when they ask the banks to provide, they are also given, they give recognition to the value of securities. The value of security is not given any benefit as far as India is concerned, number one. So that will have to be kept. I'm not commenting on these numbers per se, but that is where we are probably tighter, because the resolution process, by the time it was over, the security had no value. But now, as I agree with her, now that things have happened, we should relook at the whole thing. But having said that, I think the recovery numbers data cannot be based on the initial period, because initial period we are talking about hardcore cases where the recovery is bound to be lower. But as we build up data, I completely concede the point that we need to take that as the basis to see whether we can do this better. So I think these will have to be built in. But Reserve Bank also has another probably a rule which is a lot stricter than the rest. Now, even in restructuring, now we have had cases where, first of all, let us admit, at least to my mind, having moved to the other side for 5 years and 5 and 35 in Reserve Bank. So I'm 1/7 a commercial banker now. Now, having moved to the other side, now we'll have to admit that restructuring is also a commercial decision. These decisions can be right, these decisions can be wrong. Now, some of the problems that we face, or where we feel that Reserve Bank norms are tighter than the rest, is that for the first 2 years of restructuring, the Reserve Bank comes and says all is fine. The third year, they come and say there is a problem. So you start making provisioning as if you never did restructuring from day one. Now, that's tighter. So to say that probably all these things will have to be considered together before we take a decision how these things will have to be changed as the IBC process stabilizes.
But one point, Padmanabhan sir, staying with you before I go to Mr. Viswanathan, the problem with having a regulatory minimum requirement with no serious onus on the management to ensure that number is right in terms of provisioning. What happens is that, and in fact, we've discussed this separately, when you have a change in management, you have a nice kitchen sinking which happens, and suddenly you have a big, provision taken for cleaning up past sins. Isn't that a problem? Isn't it much better if management is told, these are regulatory minimum, but the onus is on you to ensure that the number is right, which means if there is a big change later on at any point in time, questions have to be asked as to why there is a change.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. And in fact, I had gone to when I was called one of those very few times to the BBB, I suggested that what they need to do in this case, and which luckily has happened in my bank's case, is that you have an ED in place who will be taking over as the next MD. So you recognize that this is the guy who is going to be the successor. Ask him to sign one balance sheet. Then he takes over and continues. I think all this kind of variations will disappear because he takes a responsibility.
Sure.
Now, whether it will work all times, I do not know, because there have been cases where, even in the case of largest bank, where they have been changed in the new CEO takes over, the numbers go up. But I think largely this can be sort of taken care of.
Harsh, I know you want to come in, but let me go to Mr. Viswanathan, because he's been, sir, on the same issue. What is the RBI understanding, you think?
I think I'll put it this way, that the provisional requirement has to be, I think as Mr. Harshvardhan said, It is the net present value of the inverse of the LGD.
Sure.
Simple. Okay. So that is what you must take, and the balance should be provided for. The LGD is a function of what are all the institutional mechanisms that you have for recovery, which changes over a period of time. As Mr. Padmanabhan said, it was much worse before IBC being there. It is not as good as it will be over a period of time with IBC getting, ingratiated and become part of the system. So it has to be actually therefore a function of the LGD and the time it takes to recover that net value, and so the net present value of that. I'm sure that when RBI prescribed those minimum, what was possibly on the basis of a historical trend as to how much a 90-day NPA slipped into a very bad debt that would have to be fully written off. But things obviously have changed. So I think for me, the best way to move forward, is to go to ECL, expected credit loss. So we have the INDAS, we have the IFRS.
Correct.
Okay. Of course, there are issues with ECL, whether there are people who are going to, build the right models. But if you have the right models, you can do that. I think RBI has put out its draft paper on, the ECL that is, I think, out there. So it was done with the bankers. That is one way to take it forward. Number one. Second point that I want to kind of mention is that I don't think, people should say have made provision as per RBI, because I think Mr. Padmanabhan talked also in terms of what is net NPA. So if you have a huge, your portfolio of NPAs is say substandard, you would have only made 15% provision, which means you'll have a large net NPA. So I think people should not see whether the bank has made provision as per RBI norms alone. That is the minimum. But I think there are very many other standards with which you evaluate the bank's balance sheet or its resilience, which is in terms of what its net NPAs are, what its provision coverage ratios are, because there are so many other ratios which are best. So I think very, very inappropriate to look at NPA provisioning from a very single point of whether the 15% provision on substandard has been made, has it become 25 and 40. But my long-term solution to this is move ECL.
Thank you, sir. Harsh, I'm going to come to you. By the way, Mrs. Usha Thorat has a comment here. To your point, Harsh, for the last 40 years, RBI has been taking up the tax deduction issue with the Ministry of Finance, but no relief. But Harsh, sorry, you wanted to come in.
No, I just a limited point that you mentioned about kitchen sinking when a CEO change happens. I think the role of the audit committee of the board becomes very important. I mean, how is it that there have been instances where in one quarter, 98% of the quarterly profits were provisioned, when the previous quarter, it was less than 2%. I mean, this simply should not be allowed. There has to be some accountability. I can understand CEO changing. The audit committee has not changed. It has signed on both the, so there has to be some accountability of the audit committee of the board saying, how is it that suddenly one quarter you woke up and decided that you have to provision much more?
I think the point that Mr. Vishwanathan made is right, which is that eventually when we go to IFRS, IAS,
Yes, totally agreed. Yeah.
But is it fair to say there is a lot of pressure against that as well? So to not adopt it right now, because it's never a good time to adopt something like this. So
I think I've given an interview to a wire agency on this issue, and I've kind of allowed very clearly. Number one is the Basel Committee recognizes that movement from the normal earlier system of provisioning to ECL could result in a sudden spurt in provisioning requirements, and therefore allows the impact of that on the capital to be transitioned over a 5-year period. And our assessment is that many banks, if not all, would not face any problem if the transitioning is allowed. But the problem is that there's still a sudden increase in the NPA numbers. But I don't think that is what should stop us. So the other part, of course, I've also mentioned is the legal issue, which is that the balance sheet format is prescribed in the law. And unless that is amended, we cannot mandate. So people have been asking us why NBFCs are in IFRS, INDAS, and not banks. One, of course, the NBFCs were directly brought on by the Companies Act because they were not. This was not coming from the RBI. More importantly, the legal provision with regard to the formatting of the balance sheet is not amenable today to accounting under INDAS.
Got it, sir. I'm now going to move to another area. Before we move into PSUs and PJ Nayak, which is Harsh's domain, one generic point that I want Mr. Vishwanathan and Mr. Padmanabhan to comment upon, which is the process by which RBI designs its regulations. And I have a couple of recent regulations in mind when I talk about this. The recent regulations on current account. that only the bankers, the intent is very clear. You want to monitor the end use. You don't want siphoning out of money, etc. But the way in which it was brought about has excited a lot of comment from bankers. And Padmanabhan sir, I know that you have some comments about the interpretation of FX rules when it comes to actual regulations. My question is twofold. One is, how does RBI decide what is the area where regulations are required? And is there adequate consultation with market participants in respect of making sure it's not disruptive, that we don't end up throwing the baby with the bathwater? Mr. Padmanabhan, I want you to go first, sir.
Okay. Thank you very much. I mean, with reference to your specific question on the current account rules and regulations, or let me start with what Reserve Bank of India normally does. I think most of the circulars which has impact on the banks or which has impact on the general public as far as the Foreign Exchange Department is concerned, if there is a major policy change, that always get discussed. Or there is a draft, there is a discussion. Sometimes there may be a draft followed by discussions. That sometimes there will be just a discussion if it's not a major. So there is a discussion. Now there is always a difference between what is sought by the market and what is ultimately decided by the regulator, is because of the exact difference between a micro interest and a macro interest. So that difference always remains. I think we will have to accept that. Now, you asked with reference to particularly the current account. Then let me spend a minute or more on the foreign exchange. Now, as far as the current account is concerned, first of all, you know that one of the things that happened after this blow up of NPAs in the system is that every bank, the public sector banks at least, were asked to do a forensic audit of all accounts which had become NPAs of value 50 crores and more. Now, I can tell you that 9 out of 10 cases which have been declared as frauds under this, these frauds have happened on account of diversion of funds. Now, how this diversion happened? Through opening current account and taking out the money, right? Now, this is the background in which, in fact, I said this to one of the TV channels also. This is the background in which the Reserve Bank of India came out and said that this is how it can happen. And that's all about it. Now, the nuances. I think the nuances are something whether everything has been captured, we do not know. So, first of all, why people move to we are talking about the genuine guys who move to the other banks for the cash management, is because the cash management requires a lot of technology, which initially the public sector banks were not in a position to give. Now they are all in a position to give. Most of them, they say that they're in a position to give. Now, the other thing is, in our country, it becomes very difficult having had a relationship with one bank to completely disrupt and move back. Now, so one question I have always wondered is that while you are very clear about once it is even in a collection account, as they call in the circular, without going too technical, it has to go back to the lending bank's accounts. Is there any problem in allowing a cash management also with the condition, two conditions? You cannot invest in a product which is not principal protected. The principal will have to be protected. You cannot leverage. Now, the second thing is, once that product is over, the money goes back again to the lending bank. Is there a problem? There are other smaller issues like the dividend account, the margin money for forward contracts, derivative contracts. So many issues are there. I think all that will get sorted out. But ultimately, this is the background in which. Now, the second thing is the foreign exchange. I think one of the things that I personally worry about is when the investment climate is not very good. Now, are we doing enough, or is our regulation simple enough to attract foreign investments? Now, somewhere along the path, I hold the view that the opening up or the liberalization that started with the FEMA and then further and further opening up, somewhere it has taken a beating. Now, there are so many issues that are happening, particularly with regard, one fundamental issue on which I think the country has to take a view is that why should regulation speak about the pricing that happens between a buyer and a seller in an FDI. Now, I'll tell you the background. The background mindset is on account of the over-invoicing and the under-invoicing that happens under the export and import transactions. So my submission to that is, unfortunately, we are trying to fire too many issues or solve too many problems which are unrelated to FEMA through FEMA. This is where the problem has happened as far as this pricing issue is concerned. Now it has gone beyond that. Now we have reached a stage where we miss out something. Today we have a situation where even for the so-called the foreign-owned and controlled companies, the way in which the regulations are written, it says that while one rule applies for buying, another rule applies for selling. It cannot. So ultimately, I am saying that the foreign exchange regulations will have to move and get interpreted in such a way, not based on the English of the regulations, but the actual, what is the intent behind that regulations. And that, unless there is a macro issue, I think ultimately it is his own money which is converting into foreign exchange one way or the other. So what is the concern at the macro level will have to be made very clear. So unless these issues are getting sorted out, I think there could be problems. So unfortunately, I think we are trying to tighten too many things, and all these issues are trying to be implemented through one of the laws that Reserve Bank of India administers, and that is where the problem is coming.
Thank you, Mr. Padmanabhan. Vishwanathan sir, I'm going to come to you. Mr. Padmanabhan seems like he's already 5 years away from RBI, so he's taking a fairly aggressive stance, but you're only 6 months away from RBI, so please.
Yeah, so I think let me bring some clarity on this current account issue itself. Then I will talk about the larger issue of framing. One, I think the background has been very eloquently explained by Mr. Padmanabhan, and I want to add that the RBI tried to reduce the regimen difficulties. So, for example, earlier this requirement was that you must get an NOC from every bank with whom the person had an account. Subsequently, then what happened was many of the banks will neither say yes nor no, and then the whole thing came unstuck. So we said, okay, it was sufficient to give a 15-day notice, and if nothing came by then, it can be deemed to be a no objection. But then that was gamed by even some banks, sometimes by the borrower. So ultimately, what happens is, the regulations are also an outcome of behaviors of various constituents to whom these regulations apply. I want to make that point very clear. Number two, while there was no wide public consultation on this, there was an informal consultation with IBA. It's not even informal, it's fairly formal consultation with IBA. They gave us a response. Okay, and obviously, what has come out may not be what they want, and I think exactly what Mr. Padmanabhan said, the difference between the micro view and the macro. Okay, and we have found that exactly for the reason that earlier we had cash management entities, number one. Number two, possibly there was a branch of a bank which was close to proximate to the point where the cash is. So there's a branch where the toll gate is there. Okay, that may not be your lender. But today, with digital transfers, etc., you don't need to have that in another place. So number one, and almost all banks have gotten into this cash management specialization. So the reasons for which people, for good reasons, the good reasons for which people earlier said we needed an account, current account with the bank other than the one with whom I had a credit facility, are no more valid today. Okay, and where they have been held, we have found that there have been conduits for a lot of fraudulent diversion of funds for purposes that are not related to the project. And as Mr. Padmanabhan said, can we allow some limited activities with that fund? I would say let that all had to happen from the lending bank. I don't think the person who is providing this fund, he must be there. That branch must be there only because that is the point proximate to where the cash is being generated. So if you have a retail shop who gets a lot of cash, there's a bank branch there, he must be able to remit that cash there. Beyond that, this not be the requirement. Number one. On the larger framing of regulations, if you look at the RBI's history, we have moved from being one-sided to issuing draft regulations, getting views, and then writing them. There are cases where we've even written discussion papers where we believe that you need a second stage before getting even a draft regulation in place. That we have done in some cases, but there are some cases where we believe that there's no point in consideration. So please, I'm just even if it is looking odd, please tell me what would have you expected if you had put the February 12 circular in draft, or for that matter, the June circular in draft. Okay, so I think what to put. When is there a need for consultation where we believe that we need views? When we know that the views that are going to come are going to be not going to conducive to putting a framework that we have in mind. Then it's a fast. You can put out in circular. I think Mr. There could be a case where you put out a draft and the same evening you put out a final. But that's a farce. And you just don't take anything into consideration. So I think wherever RBI has put the draft in circulation, I can tell you at least where I was there, I have ensured every point is covered. There's an internal discussion as to why that is not accepted or accepted in a modulated form. And an important, interesting example, I think, would be, the benchmark after that, benchmark rate that we came out with. Before that, we had the earlier circular, the MCLR. All those were, a lot of discussions took place. But I can tell you, they were all, very micro points. Ultimately, we had to come out with what we had to do. So, I would say it's a melange of both, and where RBI believes that this we need a view and we have scope to take others' view into consideration. I think RBI has been coming on.
Thank you, sir. Lovely viewpoints from both of you. So thank you for that. This discussion can go on, but I want to move on to the next topic. Harsh, I'm going to come to you on PSU banks. The fact that they have such a high level of NPAs compared to private sector banks. You are one of the co-signees for the PJ Naik committee report. And now we hear chatter about, or at least whispers about, a few banks getting public sector banks getting privatized, etc. Here's my question to you. Why is it that public sector banks struggle so much in terms of NPAs, high NPAs? And second, do you think the recommendations of PJ Naik committee or the current chatter about privatization of banks, will it really happen? Do you think Delhi can let go?
Yeah. So on the first question, and one reason is just the way they do business. If you look at that large three private banks, 50% plus of their book is consumer credit, which historically has had lower risk, lower credit losses compared to, let's say, commercial book, which is the case. 80% plus loan books of public sector banks are corporate credit, which is much more cyclical. It gets impacted by business cycles and so on. That's one point. Second point is what Mr. Padmanabhan made some time ago. I have seen private banks being extremely nifty getting out of corporate accounts when they even get a hint of trouble. They are very nifty. They can do quick one-time settlement, get out of an account, which is simply impossible in a public sector bank because of all the problems that they have. And to my mind, both this issue as well as the larger issue of implementation of the Naik committee, the root lies in the fact that these are companies under or these are entities under an act of the parliament. Recent RBI guideline on governance, in first page, it excuses public sector banks from those guidelines. And I understand, I empathize with RBI. RBI's writ does not completely cover them because their operative law is the Nationalization Act, which excuses these banks out of many things. One example, the Nationalization Act actually hardwires the composition of the board. It says what kind of board of members will appoint to the board of directors. So if that be the case, then how does RBI go and tell, no, you appoint some other people? So my view is that one of the reasons that we have a fundamentally uneven field in banking is because of this existence of Nationalization Act. And the simple remedy to that, which both Naik committee and many previous committees have said, is to put them under company law and make them normal committees. Many of these issues will go away. Coming back to Naik committee specifically, it had about 41 or 42 recommendations, a third of which, 14 to 15, I don't remember exact number, were addressed to the central government. Central government as the owner of public sector banks. And other than the creation of the Bank Board Bureau, I don't think there's much movement on that, whether it's a holding company or bank investment company and the thrust of those recommendations to government was, please behave like a normal shareholder. Look at the commercial. I think at the heart of this is what I have called a schizophrenia in central government. Are these banks government departments or commercial enterprises? You have to decide that. They cannot be both. And therefore, a lot of these governance issues arise out of that. And look, the political economy is such that the political instrumentality of this bank is so high that I don't see any realistic privatization happening in my lifetime. I mean, there might be smaller banks where you might try this, but there is just a huge benefit both to the bureaucracy as well as the political class to have these under government ownership, because you can do a lot of, you can use them. And Nationalization Act gives the government the power to run schemes through these banks, which is of enormous power. And so I think that's where we have to look at. If you really genuinely want to reform a public sector bank, my view is that it has to start from doing away with the Nationalization Act and put them as Companies Act companies.
Thanks a lot, Harsh. That's a fairly strong intervention and really appreciate that. I'm going to come to both Mr. Padmanabhan and Mr. Viswanathan. So your comments, sir, on some of the points that Harsh has made so eloquently. So first off, do you agree that public sector banks are inherently, given the nature of their operations, going to be susceptible to more NPAs than private sector banks? Second, do you agree with the solution set of either PJ Naik or other committees which have spoken of moving from Acts of Parliament to Companies Act, moving them under Companies Act? And third question is, do you think the government will actually go there of relinquishing control and getting them under Companies Act or making them private, as the case may be? Mr. Padmanabhan, why don't I start with you?
All right. I think as far as the why this large NPA, I think as I explained and Harsh picked up that, I think that's the speed with which the private banks are able to get out, the public sector banks are not able to get out. In fact, one of the first questions I asked as I stepped into the Bank of India was to ask, can we ask this with the Reserve Bank and the government to say that permit me to treat my credit book as trading book. The board will set the norms, we cut laws and move on. And can we do that? They say, no, nobody is going to agree on that. Now, that becomes the issue. I think if you take account after account, why the public sector bank had to hold on is because they were worried about these questions getting asked. And I again come back to this point at the cost of repetition. Please remember that any resolution which even today the Reserve Bank of India or the government has put in place again runs the whole process through a committee, because nobody individually wants to take a decision as far as that is concerned. And in public sector banks, the problem is that there is no difference in recognition between an act of omission and a commission. You take 1,000 decisions, get 2 of them wrong, you are crucified forever. You don't take any decisions in life, you will go up and get the highest post in the bank. I mean, this is a fact. This is a fact that we'll have to agree. Because ultimately, is there a charge sheet? Is there a vigilance case? All these things are there. And see, and all these things are being asked 6 years, 7 years in retrospect, why you took a decision at that point of time. Nobody has even an iota of idea. I mean, unless there is a mens rea. If you remember a case, I would suspect. In fact, as we have discussed, if I go to a dealing room, treasury dealing room, and find that the dealer is making only profits, I would suspect. Similarly, if he is able to tell you the 7-year-old story with all details, then I would suspect, because I would suspect there is a mens rea. He thought about this and he thought. Otherwise, nobody would remember why we took decision. In fact, Viswanathan and myself would agree that in many of the cases, particularly if in an FED, we don't even look at the caption, who is the party involved. We look at the case and then take a decision based on that. That's how it works. Now, whether privatization is going to be solving all this, I think if the government can reduce the shareholding to such an extent that the public sector banks have the same kind of operational freedom, that will ensure that things move and people take responsibility and they are able to take decisions. Whether it would ever happen, I have my own doubts whether it would happen, because I think I would probably clinch this issue by quoting Dr. Reddy. Nationalization was a political decision, and to move away from that will also be a political decision. So whether that decision will come through or not is $1 million question.
Thank you, sir. That's very eloquently put. Mr. Viswanathan, your take, sir.
Yeah, I think on why the NPAs are high, both the kind of nature of book that the public sector banks build, and also their inability to get out when there is a problem at a loss, is something that is a factor. And I can tell you from my personal experience, for example, I was head of vigilance and audit in IFCI. And I found that in many accounts which IFCA got stuck, there were other private sector banks
We got out.
which were part of that, which were part of the loan. But they got out much better, much earlier, maybe at a loss, maybe in terms of NPV, they got a lot more than what IFCA got keeping that in their books because they didn't want to take the decision. So I think it's an important factor that one needs to capture. And I think in terms of whether privatization, I would say first thing is that if you can divest the governance of a bank from the government, that's the first step. So the whole issue of what Mr. Harbhajan talked in terms of the Nationalization Act providing so much of powers to the government is with regard to governance. So if we can, divest governance from government, half the job is done. Okay, then you divest ownership from government, that is privatization. Okay, and there are excellent models in the world of government-owned banks running like private sector banks because the governments have created a rubber between the government and the bank to holding companies. So I think, it's very important that you create a rubber. Of course, it's important that the rubber functions. Okay, but the fact there is a rubber itself will distance the governance from the government. So I think if you ask me what the Nayak committee had suggested in creating a bank holding company or BIC, and bank holding company is something that is a good way to take it forward. Whether privatization is required, not required, it's it may be a good point to experiment. But I have a very funny view on this, which is that so long as you have public sector banks and private sector banks, the public sector banks will become a move to safe haven kind of places when there is a trouble. So you need to also have a look at how that functions. Of course, there is scope for experimentation, and as both Mr. Ashuvardan and Mr. Padmanabhan said, it's a much bigger decision. It's not purely economical. It's not just purely economic or financial. It's a much bigger decision, and one will bite the bullet.
Anand, just let me make a couple of points. I think this is critical because just let me take a minute. I think two issues also will have to be taken on board when you talk about the large NPAs of public sector banks. Most of them are infrastructure. Now, public sector banks are pushed into infrastructure funding. Whether they were equipped to do that is a big question mark. Number two, one of the things I found when I went in, and this is where again Reserve Bank of India moved in very swiftly, that we as a bank, we are into every consortium, irrespective of the percentage. Being a large bank, it will be larger, but it will be number of banks. Only one question I asked: who are the people who understand the basic business that this consortium does? Are you lending after understanding the basic business? Do you mean to say that every business in this country, we have people who understand this business, or you are simply lending because you are a part of a consortium? The decision we took was, henceforth, we will pick and choose only when we understand the business rather than getting into a consortium as a matter of routine.
Thank you, Mr. Padmanabhan. Harsh, I noticed you raising your hand. Please come in.
Yeah, so there's two quick points. One is Mr. Padmanabhan referred to how it is in public sector you can't get out of account. The other thing that I always found ironic is how these banks differentially treat credit risk and market risk. If there is a branch manager who creates a 10 lakh rupees NPA, he would be hauled over coals 7 years after his retirement. A trader in trading book could overnight lose 100 crore because of a wrong interest rate call and nothing would happen. And I have witnessed this personally. And I think that just shows that, there is just something basically wrong. Secondly, we have a model in India, Anand, where government ownership worked properly. Axis Bank for the first 10-15 years was overwhelmingly government owned through Suti and through the insurance companies. And yet it ran like a proper private bank. So we have example of actually how the government can distance itself, behave like a normal shareholder and let a bank grow and flourish. So we don't have to scratch our heads and figure out how this is going to work. It has actually worked. Suti acted as that rubber that Mr. Vishwanathan talked about, where it appointed directors on the board, it had some control, but it ran like a private sector bank. So I think we have models, we have to learn from them.
No, great. Thanks a lot, Harsh. In fact, Mr. Kannan makes a good point here, which is that the questions I'm asking are kind of unfair because the person we are referring to, which is the government, unfortunately, their representative is not here. And point taken, Mr. Kannan, we'll try and get somebody from the government in our next panel to discuss. But I want to now move to the last topic, which is on governance. And Mr. Vishwanathan, I'll come to you first because I think you would have had a big role to play in the discussion paper on governance, which the RBI has come out with recently. So a couple of quick questions, sir. First is, what do you think are the basic roots of governance issues in banking and NBFCs? It's a very broad question, but I want your thoughts on this. Secondly, Mr. Damodaran, and you would have seen this, has come with a fairly strong critique of the discussion paper that on governance. I would love to hear your comments. Of course, he makes the point which Harsh mentioned earlier, which is that it doesn't cover PSU banks. Of course, that's not your problem or it's not your fault. It's not out of your control. But nevertheless, he makes that point and other points as well. But I would love to hear your take on that, sir.
What we found in the course of our assessment of how banks have been run is that I think there was a beautiful paper, somebody had written, I can't remember what it is. They said that you have only two types of boards. One where it is run by the CEO or it is run by one board member. If it's a public sector bank, the government normally kind of. So what we want is a proper balance between this. I have said this many times that ultimately governance is getting the various power structures. I am again making difference between power structure and power center. There are different power structures that are provided for checks and balances. Those power structures should be adequately empowered for them to work as checks and balances. Otherwise, they'll be there for the sake of it. And therefore, the entire governance structure that Reserve Bank has tried to put in place has come about from the fact that the checks and balances have not worked adequately. So you have one part of the power structure too strong and others going along. Right? Or in whichever part is that, it's not good. We are not saying it should be so big. So I have said that we don't want a board-run bank, but what we want is a board-governed bank. So you do not want a CEO run and CEO governed bank. You want a board-governed bank and a CEO or an executive management run bank. So I think the governance paper kind of articulates that. Just because this topic was on governance and reflections on banking governance, there's an interesting paper that was posted in a blog called. I just look at that. I just took some notes yesterday. It's this Harvard Law School Forum on Corporate Governance. Okay. There's a paper posted on it in 2018 on what the large 25 European banks have done post the crisis. Very, very interesting analysis there. And many of the things that we have tried to do through this governance paper are, putting that as a regulatory requirement, because we are not too sure that our banks would do it on their own. If they should have done it on their own, they should have done it by now. RBI had to intervene to prevent conflict of interest between the risk manager and the others in business. See, so this is the fundamental problem. It's not that RBI would want to kind of dictate those things, but when it is found that the regulated entities aren't doing what they should do in the normal course, then the regulator comes in with the mandates. So so you have the risk officer, then you have the audit management committee, all these things again becoming independent power structures to provide us the checks and balances. So just to kind of, very interestingly, that paper says, because one of the things that people say is that this is putting too much of onus on it's too onerous for the board members. That paper, Harvard paper says, there's a 30% increase in the workload of non-executive directors and non-executive chairmen after the crisis. Number one. Okay. And the UK, European authorities have placed a limit on how many non-executive positions a non-executive director can have, a non-executive director of a bank can have. The idea being that they want that non-executive director to spend a lot of time on the bank. So I think in terms of what the governance paper is asking, is what we would have expected the banks to do themselves, which unfortunately they haven't. And as I've again said, it's a discussion paper. There can be tweaks here and there, but nobody, I think, can question, at least that's my view, people can definitely differ. My view is nobody can question the underlying thought process that went into the paper that the RBI has come out with. And of course, as Mr. Hanswardhan rightly pointed out, the public sector banks are specifically excluded for two reasons. One, they are governed by the Public Sector Bank Act, Nationalization Act, and secondly, there's a provision, I think section 54 of the BR Act, which is what provisions of the BR Act are applicable to public sector bank. And
Absolutely.
many aspects relating to governance are excluded from there.
Excluded
RBI does
from,
not have a
absolutely.
mandate to provide those things. So legally, we don't have a mandate to tell them you can do this, you can do this. And therefore, RBI had to kind of, from a legal point of view as well, exclude those provisions for applicability to the public sector banks. I think that's what I wanted to say.
Fair enough, sir. Harsh, you wanted to comment? Please comment.
Yeah, so I think if coming to the governance guidelines that and the draft discussion paper, I think the paper is excellent. It's extremely detailed. It basically adopts the Basel Committee standards and FSB standards on governance. It goes into very granular details about how various entities that participate in governance actually should do their role. But I will always say this, Anand, that it is a manual of process. It prescribes rituals. Rituals does not get you the religion. There is a spirit of governance which needs to be actually encouraged, and I think there are many other things. So, for example, I have always been surprised that despite the fact that we have many bank failures, the independent directors in those banks have not faced any consequences. None of them have been even debarred from serving in public companies for a period of time, which is a very common action that gets taken. During the Nayak committee time, actually, I interviewed almost half a dozen people who sit on as independent directors on foreign banks in Western countries. And one of the common theme that came out was that post the global financial crisis, their actually role has dramatically increased. And they actually spend far more time, on average was 3 to 4 working days in a month. And also they engage directly with the first line of reporting of the CEO, independent of the CEOs. I think a lot of those things we have to start doing. I think the role of the board, while this governance paper does talk about, I think it is too process oriented. The risk in doing that is that ticking of the boxes might happen. Boards will say, yes, we have done A, B, C, D, without understanding really the spirit behind it.
That's a very good way of putting it. Padmanabhan sir, I'm going to come to you. You want to react to either what is...
I want to react. First of all, a general comment. I think you highlighted the fact that Mr. Damodaran has been critical of the Reserve Bank of India discussion paper. I think generally Mr. Damodaran is critical of anything that Reserve Bank of India puts. So the other point is, I think when we are talking about the issues that Harsh flagged, for instance, about the directors playing a more active role. Please juxtapose that also with the fact about what is the remuneration that is being paid to the directors. You cannot pay peanuts here and expect them to deliver the same thing which they are delivering overseas. I think we will have to have a... Now, I'm glad about one thing. 2 years ago, whenever I used to go to KEFRAL and talk about governance, the topic was governance in public sector. Now, after a long time, Reserve Bank of India has come out with a governance which excludes public sector banks. So governance is now, I think, ownership neutral, and the problems are more as far as the private sector banks are concerned. Although I think Viswanathan is going to shout at me for this, I never know why Reserve Bank of India cannot put a sledgehammer once in 3 years when these fellows come to you for renewal. So that's a different matter. But having said that, I think public sector banks, I need to place on record, is facing huge problems. Now, let me just highlight this problem by telling what I was forced to do. As chairman of the bank, I was forced to work as a member of the audit committee to make sure that the audit committee has enough quorum. There's no quorum in any of the committees. Now, I have gone out, end of the month, one of my executive directors will go out, how the bank will find the quorum. Now, this is one thing which I have never understood the way it works for public sector banks. On the day of appointment of the MD or the director, the government exactly knows when he is demitting office. Now, why can't we start the process sufficiently in time to make sure that these vacancies are not filled up? And I am trying to say that this problem is so serious. Now, Reserve Bank of India comes every time, and the first observation or the first action point that I have in the inspection report is your board is incomplete. Now, we have no idea, we have no way we can do anything about it. So let me give a counter suggestion to Reserve Bank. Viswanathan is no longer there. is that if the board is incomplete, please throw me out of the refinance market, saying that your repo amount is cut by half. Then let us see whether we get directors in time. I mean, this is a very serious issue. If the members are not there, how does a board discharge its functions? And that is why I'm glad that this is, because otherwise the kind of rigor that this paper brings in, like one committee chairman cannot be in another committee, etc. I don't think the public sector bank ever will have numbers, ever. So this is an issue that needs to be seriously thought through. Because let us not talk about privatization. Let's not talk about anything. You please ensure that the public sector banks work with the full quorum as far as the boards are concerned. I think many of our issues can be resolved.
In deference to Mr. Kannan's point, we will get somebody from the government to answer some of these questions, because these are really serious questions. And I think the point Mr. Vishwanathan made also, that the BR Act and the Nationalization Act, etc., actually prevent RBI from doing what it would have loved to do, I guess, otherwise. But I'm going to come to Mr. Vishwanathan for the last question before I take questions from the audience. Harsh made a great point about rituals versus religion. Some of what has been described in the discussion paper can eventually become ticking in the boxes. So a couple of questions, sir, which come out of this. One is to Mr. I think it was Harsh's point again, or was it Mr. Padmanabhan's point on accountability? If we actually see boards failing, do we actually do something about it? Does the regulator actually say, the following directors have to be careful, or some action has to be taken, through the acts, as Mr. Padmanabhan said? That's one question. Second question, sir, is are we asking too much out of the board? So for instance, if you say that the audit committee or in the risk committee, the CEO should not be part of it, and it should be entirely managed by independent people, is that really possible? Is that a practical situation where the CEO of the bank doesn't have oversight over significant chunks of management? Both these comments.
So one, I think, to Mr. Hart's point about the religion and the rituals, I think the religion is also there in the paper. As to ultimately what we are saying is that we want a bank that is well governed by the board and run by the executive, and the board should ask the right questions. See, the whole point, if you ask me in terms of, you ask me whether is there too much being expected from the board. One is that's what we are saying, what is the role expected. So there's much more great clarity today in terms of what is expected from each committee, what are they going to be responsible for and accountable for, and then then you are able to hold them to account as to say this is what was expected from you, have you done, number one. And number two is unless it's something very blatant. So when it's blatant, you supersede the board. You have powers to do that. Okay, and then sometimes what happens is that many positions are required to be filled by the banks themselves. Okay, now the boards the nomination committees are supposed to do due diligence. Don't they know all those things? That if somebody was part of a failed bank, why should that bank take him as a director on its board, independent director? It's very funny to me. Okay, obviously those information will be with RBI when the person has to be approved for appointment. If it's going to be a CEO or a chairman, that appointment gets approved by the RBI. Obviously, RBI will take that into consideration. But when RBI has to formally ban somebody, then it must have kind of evidence to fix accountability. It could be legally challenged. So those are kind of things one need to kind of take forward. So I think the real effectiveness in getting right people on the board rests with the nomination committee. So I think there's an interesting point that it's a lot of effort is being, a lot of job, importance is being placed on independent directors, but the board chooses independent directors.
Exactly.
True, that is true. But I think what we're saying is that we need to have much more greater clarity on the roles of independent directors and what they are accountable for. So just to kind of take a point away, for example, if you look at the RBI Act, when it comes to a non-bank finance company, okay, where you can take criminal action, okay, in the case of a director, it is not just sufficient that you prove he was there in the board, he contributed to it, to a wrong decision. So the standards expected to evaluate a contribution for formally debarring a person are much higher, it can get challenged in the court. I'm not saying RBI should not do it. So where the bank, RBI superseded the board, obviously, there's a very clear signal that the bank has given them. But I would say the real job has to be done by the Nomination and Remuneration Committee.
NRC.
I agree with Mr. Padmanabhan that remuneration has to change. People should adequately remunerated, but the increase in the workload of bank board members is a global phenomenon, because I think the incentives, please be very clear, the incentives for executive functioning in a bank are different from that, in a non-financial entity. I also mentioned this point. And therefore, you need to have a balance coming from the board. So the roles expected of a board member or a board of a financial entity is of an entirely different kind. And that is why there are more restrictions on those things. I mean, where is the chairman of a company approved by a regulator? It doesn't happen unless it's a financial entity. They are a different kettle of fish. So I think we must accept.
No, thank you very much, sir. That's very well put. And Mr. Padmanabhan, both Harsh and I owe you a debt of gratitude for pushing the cause of increasing the remuneration of board directors.
Particularly after I have left.
Particularly after you have left. So that's extremely selfless of you, and both Harsh and I are very, very happy with you. But, one question to Mr. Viswanathan and Mr. Padmanabhan. By the way, I'm covering some questions here which have come anonymously to me as well. When we talk of governance, lots of other stakeholders have been questioned as well, including auditors, credit rating agencies, etc. One stakeholder is the RBI supervision itself. Particularly with what happened around PNB and what happened around PMC, etc. Is RBI supervision up to the mark? Is it strong enough to keep governance going? Any of you can go ahead, please.
No. I think I will come in, because I think, to be fair, see, first of all, the kind of issue that happened in Punjab National Bank, I don't think supervisors in any country, anywhere in the world would have found it. Let me be very clear on that. If it is an internal issue created by internal fraudsters, how do you think that a Reserve Bank inspector is supposed to find out? He looks at few sample transactions and finds out. So this is the challenge I am throwing, that a Punjab National Bank type of problem would not have been found by the regulator anywhere in the world on the basis of an on-site supervision. He would have found out based on some information that comes through, he checks into it, and all these kind of things happen. So we will have to be fair to the inspection process. But having said that, now the technology provides many things. Can there be a better system in terms of alerts, audit trails that you need to look into? That's a system of improvement that you will have to continuously look into. But having said that, there are certain telltale signs which will have to be built into this whole process. For instance, without mentioning the bank, when we know that the bank has a non-fund based income which is 10 times the size of a bank, which is 1/10 of which is 10 times bigger than this, why were questions not asked? When the kind of issues that happened in one of the largest NBFCs which failed, which probably got flagged, why it was next. There could be in retrospect questions asked, but please understand that during the time of inspection, and I can vouch for this because I have been a part of this process for a long time. I have done the inspection of head office of 12 banks. Now, I don't think at the time of an inspection, the granular details, particularly when an insider is trying to, cover up things, ever comes out, except when there is an iota of doubt which gets picked up either through a casual conversation or a complaint, but not in the normal course of business. So to blame Reserve Bank of India for not picking up the Punjab National Bank, let me say, is unfair. And this I am saying even 5 years after I had quit Reserve Bank.
Very well argued, sir. Harsh, you want you raising your hand as
No,
well?
a quick point with Mr. Padmanabhan's comment. You must distinguish between frauds and supervisor and regulatory issues. No supervisor or regulator can deal with fraud. Fraud is a crime. Crime is a law enforcement issue. It's not a regulatory or supervisory issue. You cannot expect anywhere in the world to bank. And remember, RBI does not audit bank. It inspects bank, which is a very different thing. So I think you have to cut some slack to the supervisor. These are not issues that we should expect them to catch.
Absolutely. Don't disagree at all. Mr. Viswanathan, I think the case has been made very eloquently. You want to add something there?
So I think I would actually want to put it in a little different way, which is that, like any watchdog type of authority, they wouldn't want any of these things to happen. Okay, I mean, it is one to say that it's not, their accountability is not there. It's not a direct failure, but nevertheless, the kind of discussion that arises, that a bank under your watch had this happening, that is something a regulator would want to avoid. Okay, so I just want to recall the answer that Dr. Acharya gave to a question regarding do central banks accept mistakes or something like that. You had asked him, and he said that they accept mistakes by changing processes. Okay, so I'm not saying some cases you do, but every time you change the process, it is not necessarily an indication of acceptance of the mistake. It is as Mr. Padmanabhan said, you would learn. I mean, if something similar happens, how do we find it? I think so. It's a process that one does. So it's not fair to put the blame on the regulator supervisor. Having said that, I think I agree. That's what I wanted to tell. What Mr. Harshvardhan said. You must deal with fraud as crime. Okay. So, and I think if you want to prevent frauds, if you want to prevent murders, okay, you must book the people, convict them, and punish them. Otherwise, murders will go up plenty. Okay. So I think I always again give this example of Madoff. Madoff happened in US. Okay.
Correct.
But look at what happened to him. Enron happened in US. Look at what happened to them. But so I think the prevention, the foil for frauds is a very effective criminal justice system that books the right people, convicts them, and punishes them in a manner that sets the right example.
Great. I'm very conscious that we've overshot time, and apologize for that. Mr. Vishwanathan, one last couple of questions, if you don't mind, if I can impinge upon you. This is from Sriram Mahadevan. Inevitable question, so I'm going to read it out to you. The draft on capping the tenure of CEOs and promoter CEOs, given that it's coming on the backdrop of one such bank facing challenges, aren't we going by a narrow sampling bias? Shouldn't this be addressed by a lot more improving surveillance than go after leadership talent, which is actually scarce? He goes on to say, we still have a lot of regulatory arbitrage between the lending entities, between an NBFC and a bank. Is it time for these to be harmonized towards an activity-based regulation? Are we moving towards that?
So one, I think harmonization, I think I'll answer the last question first. Harmonization is something that we must do. So wherever there is regulatory arbitrage, that must be addressed. No two ways about it. But having said that, please understand that if the regulations are alike for both, then license them as a bank. So the fact that you are calling them an NBFC not able to accept public deposits means that you are treating them differently. So you need to know what to harmonize, what not to harmonize. So what I would say is, if there is a bank and a bank NBFC, okay, you must not make a difference, because then the bank will push many of its business to the NBFC, which will be problematic. So I think, so what you need to harmonize, how you harmonize between what you want to harmonize, I think it's a very important call that you must take. But harmonization as far as possible is a good thing to do. Okay. Now, capping of the CEO, what do you call tenure? I want to refer to the paper that I had mentioned in my intervention. It says during the period from 2008 till now, all the 86% of those banks have changed the CEOs. Okay. Now, even in the cases, where RBI refused extension, the board did not say recommend. So I think that the whole problem that, let's be very clear, so the whole problem that we need to understand is that we need to have a very powerful, empowered board that is able to act independently. And very many times, entrenchment, also creates a power center. I'm not generalizing things, but I think, so in terms of whether are we making one sample as a basis to do what we're doing, what we're saying is that as a principle, it is good. So it might work well in one case that, a person who stays for 25 years does well. But ceteris paribus, in general, you are likely to create more problems with an entrenched, CEO for too long, as opposed to that being established.
Thank you very much, sir. Harsh, I noticed you were raising your hand. You want to add?
So quickly, 2 points. One, I totally agree with Mr. Vishwanathan. Look, banks and NBFCs are alike, but they are not identical. In fact, NBFCs exist precisely because some things banks don't do. So you can't force fit a common harmonization does not meaning force fitting a common regulatory framework. You have to keep in mind, you have to recognize the fundamental business model differences and make sure that all arbitrages are taken away, but you can't treat them same way. On CEO tenure, my own preference would be all good boards should have an internal retirement policy that gets applied. I would rather the regulator not prescribe it. It's in the self-interest of an enlightened board to actually have a policy and enforce it, whether it's a quote unquote promoter entity or widely held entity.
Great point. Again, I'm very conscious of time. A lot of questions, for instance, that Deepak Agarwal has raised relating to governance, hopefully has got covered in the discussions that we've had. So I'm going to stop out here. Excellent discussion, sirs, and thank you very much for this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to allow you closing comments. If there is something that you want to add, reiterate from the discussion that we've had so far, or something we didn't pick up and you want to bring up to light. Mr. Padmanabhan, you want to go first, sir, on any closing comments?
No, I mean, I think we have covered most of it. The only thing is that I think there has been too much discussion about whether privatization is going to solve the ills of all the financial sector in this country. I think this example I always like to say is that I think most of the CEOs of the private banks who are doing very well have had their stint in the public sector banks as well. So I am always reminded of that never-ending Hindi serial, which, if I remember right, Saas Bhi Kabhi Bahu Thi. So every private sector bank also at some stage worked in the public sector. Why is able to do better in the private sector is because of the operational freedom. So one of the suggestions I made in one of these conferences was that, why don't you pick up a bank, one bank, give them the same kind of operational freedom, and then try to see how they compare with the private sector banks in terms of performance for a year or two, then take your debate further whether privatization is going to solve all your problems. I think I reiterate that because I think people seem to think that I think particularly after the book and the series of interviews that Mr. Virla Acharya gave, I think public sector was thought to be doomed in this country. I think we are far away from that.
Sure. Harsh, you want to add something?
Yeah, just a quick comment. All our discussion about moratorium restructuring raises one very deep issue in my mind, and which is this. Our entire policy apparatus seems to think that banking system is an instrument that needs to be used to bail out real economy. You must recognize banking also is a business. All these things impose a cost on banking. A healthy banking system is supremely critical for a healthy economy. We cannot impose costs on banking system even with the noble intention of bailing out the real economy. Ultimately, it's going to hurt you. So I hope that in the current crisis, we don't follow the same thinking. We don't push the banks hard to say give concessions and do restructuring at your cost because we want to rescue the real economy.
Thank you, Harsh. In fact, Mehul Pathak had a question which I hope has got answered by what you just mentioned, and thank you for that. Mr. Vishwanathan, last word to you, sir.
Thanks. I think a couple of things we could also, I'll combine what Mr. Padmanabhan said and what Mr. Harsh said. One is that you could also look at what happens if a successful private sector banker runs a public sector bank. Okay, how has it been? You could try that as well. So that's another study you can make to possibly understand that it's not just person specific, but the operational circumstances specific in terms of the outcomes coming to what they are. On the last point, which Mr. Harsh made no two views about it. I think I've gone on record saying that I'm not too sure. I'm not sure about whether a restructuring is required, but if it is required, it has to be very tight, and I must say that it's pretty tight. There is a very it again comes from one of the points which Mr. Harsh made. That there is this huge problem of tag in India. It doesn't matter how bad your account is, so long as you're not called NPA, you're fine. Yeah. You could be 120-day default, but don't call
me NPA. Correct.
No, I think the whole clamor. I mean, I do not have a problem with restructuring at all. In fact, the February 12th circular or the June 7th circular allows restructuring. It only says recognize the problem. So I have said that. In fact, in a lecture, I think in one of the colleges, I said that if you have replaced the part of a vehicle, it is not the original. You must understand that. If you don't recognize that's the problem. So I think the entire edifice of restructuring, or the problem that we had with the CDR mechanism, was that the restructuring was done with the view to keeping this, avoiding the NPA attack. And then you create a web around all that. So I think if you ask me, because many of the people after this circular on restructuring that has been that's come out, people are talking, why only 30 days? What happened to the pre-30 days? They can be restructured in the February, June 7 circular. But
Absolutely. Yes.
So there is no bar. So I think the restructuring is by itself not a bad thing. But restructuring with forbearance is the problem.
Absolutely.
So I think if you ask me, RBI has been pretty choosy. One part I want to add to what Mr. Padmanabhan said, possibly the committee approach is there from the point of view of providing comfort to the bankers. But having said that, I thought the other important point for the committee is that earlier in the CDR had an empowered committee which was largely consisted of the bankers themselves. So what do you expect them to take? So this is a committee which is taken away from the bankers. So I think in terms of compliance of the requirements of the restructuring scheme, this committee will be able to ensure that the processes are completely done. So they are not going to evaluate the assumptions, but they will go through the process. That is what is very important. So I think, in my opinion, maybe once the IBC gets back into steam, I don't think we will have those old days of pretend and extend. People will recover, and I want to use this forum to say that IBC is the last resort, but it must be resorted to. So long as you don't threaten to resort to it, people will not think it is there. And that's the problem that we have. And I think that's the way I want to end it.
Oh, excellent, sir. I couldn't have summed this up better. IBC is a last resort, but it should be resorted to if required. And I think that's what you were trying to do in the February circular, precisely to achieve that. But excellent comments from all of you. Look, this has been an extremely enriching discussion. I've learned a lot. And we will, in the Center for Financial Studies, try and put this together. The intent is not just to have these nice webinars. It's to take away some of the knowledge that you've given us and the wisdom you've given us, and try and take it forward in terms of what could be prescriptions for policymakers and people, the powers that be. So we've discussed a lot relating to recognition, resolution, disclosures, as you put it, Mr. Viswanathan, and Harsh, as you did. We discussed about provisioning, framing and interpretation of regulations, and I love the way you talked about the English of regulations versus the spirit of regulations, sir. I think that was fantastic. PSU banks, as you said, we had a long discussion. I think the broad consensus, if I can put it there, is you don't need privatization for privatization's sake, but there is a question of giving operational and professional autonomy to bankers to do their job, and allowing them to do their job and be accountable to it. Maybe, as Harsh puts it, putting them under Companies Act, level playing field is, and as Mr. Viswanathan also put it, is the first step. Privatization is not necessarily the first step that we have to go into. At least that's what I took away. And of course, on governance, a very, very rich discussion. This is a topic that I think will remain warm for a long, long time. It's not going to stop out here. But excellent discussion. So thank you again, once again, Harsh, Mr. Padmanabhan, Viswanathan, sir. Really appreciate this. We will try and take this. By the way, there's a closing question which I cannot help but ask, which has come from Vishal Purohit, which says, when is Mr. Viswanathan book getting released? And by the way, I know there was a separate discussion about Mr. Padmanabhan's book also in a separate mailing chain. Look forward to that book as well.
I am writing for him and he is writing for me for a change.
Harsh, I will not ask you. You have a long career to go before you write a book, so I'm not going to ask you as yet. But thank you again, gentlemen. Really appreciate this very, very enriching discussion, and we will try and take this forward. Thank you extremely, and have a great evening ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you.